A pleasure to meet all at last, and today we're at it once again with the Vlog-A-Thon. In this piece of the Vlog-A-Thon, I'm going to be covering the second quarter of the likes of the year 2025, because let's just say that April, May, and June were even more eventful than January, February, and March 2025. So I will say that in terms of trips, this part alone is just as big of a strength as I had said before. I made a trip to the Harley-Davidson Center, the Mitchell Park Domes, as well as Louisville, Kentucky, just to name a few things. So while the first quarter of 2025 held its own in terms of the trips factor, things that I have done for recreation or just pure entertainment, the thing is that the second quarter of 2025 was even bigger. But at the same time, there was a bit of a snag. Kind of like what happened in spring of 2024, spring 2025, while at first it wouldn't offer up anything real big in its own entirety, a rather large negative came into play. And you might have seen some videos that I had taken last year in which that my hand was bandaged up. Yeah, so the thing is, I had an accident on the job, and it took me nearly 2 weeks to fully recover from this whole thing. My hand got smushed, and a bunch of fractures were discovered, and even bits of my fingers ended up getting ripped into shreds. So while I can say for sure, it doesn't really look like much has happened to it by now, but that's just because the power of my healing has been pretty big. Yet at the same time though, there were all the trips I'd done. In April, I had done a lot with Choo Choo and Kramer. These two guys, I'm serious when I say that I have taken them out to many places to go on a hike. And I will say that's another really big strength that I've done throughout spring of 2025. But then of course we could get into the movies, because while I hadn't watched very much throughout 2025 up until April and May, I will say that Death of a Unicorn, Minecraft movie, and even the likes of Final Destination Bloodlines, all of that combined creates to make one unique, eventful way to spend my time in the theaters. But let's also not forget the fact that there's just a good amount of other stuff I could talk about just as well. The trips, I will say, a good majority of them were railroad related. And while this did not include the IRM, Illinois Railway Museum, that of course would actually show up later, as well as another trip to Boone, Iowa, just as I had spoken about for 2024. Anyways though, the railroading part of the trips included rail fanning, as usual, but there were also a few railroad museums I had visited as well. There was the East Troy Electric Line, as well as its own adjacent museum, which, for the record, I had not gone to since 2005. Yeah, so 20 years later, I went on back there, and wouldn't you know, they were pretty impressive, just like how it was back then. I remember going to East Troy a few times, and we had a few rides on the electric line, which of course took us to various locations, including a place, a well-known local market, which of course is located just outside of East Troy in its entirety. But I will say that it definitely brought back a lot of memories. Another railroad museum I had visited was the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay. Yeah, it's in the small community of Ashwaubenon, not far from the city of Green Bay itself, the home of the Packers. But then we can definitely add in a few other things just as well. A few other trips that I, of course, had done just as well, though not nearly as large as with the trips I had previously described. So, even though I had a job injury, I was given about a couple weeks to recover before I would eventually return to work, and during that time I had of course gone to the likes of the East Troy and the National Railroad Museum. So all of that in a good span of 12 days. So That's a good amount of time to recover from a crushed hand, but even more impressive is just the fact that I had spent my time in a pretty good way. I, of course, had gone to the chocolate factory, Menominee Falls, just as well, as I had done a few times before throughout 2024. But then, of course, we could get into other things just as well. A lot of the work I have done as well. But let's not forget, I hadn't done much of Gaming with Kaiju Force Neo the first impressions, mainly for the fact that I was cutting back for some time. But the real big thing about this time in 2025 was when I took on the unique challenge, creating railroad documentaries. As you might know by now, 1 year later, this comes to be known as T-Rex, or Transportation Rex for short. I will say, it's a name that actually catches on pretty well. And by this point, I have managed to make a couple dozen of these documentaries. At least once a month, they have been showing up on the scene. But let's also not forget that this would just be the start of T-Rex related stuff. Because up until May 31st of 2025, especially going into June and all that stuff, I was able to make 3 documentaries with a combined total of a few 100,000 views and even over 10,000 likes on the channel itself. A majority of the views at the time came by the wreck of Sioux Line 2719 26 years later. And in terms of the likes, well, a good majority of that number came by the Mosier, Oregon derailment 9 years later, which this year marks the 10th anniversary. So less than a year later, and Mosier, Sioux Line, as well as an April 2025 documentary known as Norcross, Georgia, these 3 videos were especially a big opportunity that I'm more than glad I took up. And since then, it has become a big series. I, of course, will get into detail on more of the T-Rex documentaries I've made so far in future installments of the Vlog-A-Thon. So, my 26th birthday came to be, a lot of video games, a lot of movies, a lot of trips. And I'd say that's a great way to piece together all that, especially as it means to counteract against the crushed hand on the job. So, make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.